Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. We are here for a open Q&A FEND webinar with Ryan, and we're going to go and take some of the pre-submitted questions first, and then we'll go into live questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Hey everyone, I hope you can hear me. I hope you've been well. I hope you haven't been stressing too much about front-end projects, and hopefully with this session I can help. Now with that, I'm gonna go to the first question. This is under the Project 2 memory game topics. So I'm gonna start with this first one. Need guidance on memory game project, getting stuck, pushing items to array. Okay, so there's probably just one array you're going to be working with, and that's the array with the elements in it. So I don't have that card project with me. Just bear with me one moment. I'm going to go to Udacity and grab it really quickly. But as far as pushing items to array, I think that's something very simple. Shouldn't be too hard to accomplish that. So I'm going to sign in, wait for this to load. Udacity is always updating their website, which is good. Okay, so I'm going to come down and go to front end. And I'm going to go to memory game. And I'm going to the memory game project repository. Okay, so I'm going to open this really quickly, grab a copy, and come back to this first question. You just download this. All right, so I have this project from the GitHub right here on my desktop, and I'm using Atom text editor. So let's go ahead and open it and see where we start from. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and press F12 on Windows to open the DevTools. And it comes to the console. Now, inside the project, we have a JS file, which is app.js. And we have the shuffle function, which shuffles an array. Now, as far as setting up the array that's going to have all of these list items in it. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at what it is that we want to get. So we know we have this unordered list element. And inside of it, we have list items. So to create an array, we just use a keyword to declare a variable. So let's say let cards equals, and array syntax uses brackets. This will initialize an empty array. You can also select the cards using the document object. So I'm gonna do li cards equals document dot query selector. Now I want all of them, so I'm going to use all. I'm going to pass in a string of what I want to query for, which are li tags with the class card. So I'm going to do li.card. I save this, come out to the console and refresh. And if I call li cards, you can see we have a node list, and it's each card on the unordered list. So coming back to the question, getting stuck pushing items to an array. So when you know you have a variable that has an array object, we can add items to it using the push method right here. If I were to push 1, my call cards, you get 1 item in it. I push another item, let's say 5. We call cards again. You can see you got 1 and 5. So whenever you want to add items to an array, you can use the push method to add it to the back, or you can use unshift. And this should add items to the front of the array. They're called cards. You can see 7 is at the front. So there are 2 methods you can use to add items to an array. You can use push to add items to the end of it, or you can use unshift to add it to the front of the array. Now, second question is, I'm having trouble with the counter function. Yeah, I've seen many implementations, and let me just say that there's no one right way to do it. I'm going to give you guys a little insight of how I would do it. So let's say we have variables that we can use to keep track of information. So let's say hour, let's say minutes, and then seconds. All right. Now time is always updating, so I know that I'm likely going to use an interval function. Now I know that developer.mozilla.org is the official documentation, so I'm gonna come here for a quick reference, and looking at their syntax, I can see that they assign that interval to a variable so we can clear it later when we need to. So the first argument is a function. The second one is the time at which you want the iteration to go. So I'm going to create a timer variable. And then I'm going to create a function that starts the timer. In this function, what do I want to happen? Well, I know that I'm going to need to get access to that interval later. So I'm going to assign it to timer equals set interval. I'm going to take 2 arguments. One is an anonymous function. The second is at which pace. So I'm going to do 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. Now for every second, what do I want to do? Okay, so each second, I want to increase the seconds variable. Actually, let me set that equal to 0. Minutes will start at 0. Hour will start at 0 by default. And for every second, seconds is going to increment. Now, I know that every 60 seconds is 1 minute. So I'm going to check that by doing if seconds is equal to 60, I know 1 minute will have passed. So in this if case, I'm going to increment minutes by 1 and then reset seconds to 0. Okay. Now we have a function here that's going to start the timer. We're going to need one to actually stop it. I'm going to create a function. There's going to be stop timer. Now all we need to do to clear an interval, let's go ahead and look at ClearInterval. Either of these two links are fine. Let's take a look at this one. So to clear it, we just need to call a ClearInterval and pass in the variable that has the reference to a set interval that we want to stop. So I'm just going to call ClearInterval, pass in the variable that has a reference to a set interval. So let's go ahead and save this. Actually, let me just try adding one more function that's going to format it. I'm going to say function format time. And this function, I'm just going to format the time. So I'm going to say let sec equal. I'm going to use a ternary, which is like an inline if statement. If seconds greater than 9, meaning 10 and above, then I'm going to do string seconds. If not, I'm just going to do 0 plus a string of the seconds variable. And same thing for minutes. And I'm going to return the string plus colon plus this variable. Go ahead, save this, give it a try. If I call seconds, you can see it's starting at 0. Minutes is starting at 0. Let me zoom in just in case you guys can see this. An hour, 0. We're not using hour, but just so it's there. Now let me go ahead and call this start timer function. And let me just call format time. Call it again. 13. Oh, I got it mixed up. Minutes goes before seconds. All right. And actually, to actually see it live, let's go ahead and log format time. Refresh it. I'll start time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so forth. I can stop the timer with this function. And I can start it again with the same function as before. And we continue where we left off because we are leveraging programming's concept of variables, which keep information. So hopefully that helps give an idea of how you can create your own timer logic. All right. Now, hi, I did Grow with Google Challenge Phase 1, and the JS classes are a distant memory to me. What can I do to work on my JS chops in order to gain confidence and the ability to work out Project 2? Yeah, so first let me say that great things take time, and JavaScript and programming in general is a great skill to have. So, it's a learning process. Don't beat yourself up if you're not getting things quickly. What I like to do personally is I'm going to come to my desktop and I'm just going to create a new folder. I'm just going to call this Sandbox. Right now, inside Sandbox, I'm just going to create a blank HTML file, and I'm going to create a blank script file. Inside this, since Adam recognizes this as the HTML file, I can just scaffold using HTML. And I'm going to create a script tag that's going to link to that script file I just made. Okay, so let me go ahead and open that up in the browser. So here I have my Sandbox folder. I'm going to open this, get a blank screen. And I often find myself just trying out code in the console since I get live feedback. And one site that has helped me out a lot is the official documentation. And I don't see it, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with W3 schools. I come here a lot because they have everything you need to know about JavaScript laid out in a chronological order as far as concepts and how you should learn it. So what I did starting out was just go through each of these links in this order. And for every new concept that I'm learning, I will come back to the Sandbox and just try it out, right? So let's say statements. We can create variables and we can assign values to variables. I'll come to the next topic when I'm comfortable, get used to the syntax. I'll come to the next topic or the next link, just pretty much learning all about the language and trying it as I'm learning it, right? So let's say you are comfortable with JavaScript and you just need to find a method to do a particular thing. You may find yourself coming to this website, which is the official documentation. This is the JavaScript's main landing page. And on the left-hand side, you'll see tutorials and you'll see references. So under functions, you'll see a lot of function references, statement references, all of JavaScript's built-in objects, right? Let's say I want to go to array object. I have a brief summary of what it is, how it works. I can see its syntax, and I can see all of its properties and methods here on the left-hand side. So all array objects have this for each method, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. This allows you to run a function against each item in that array, and you can do things with it. So really for me, I just come to these two websites, and whenever I'm learning something new, I just come to my Sandbox and I just try it out. So hopefully that works for you. If not, there are many resources. Like Udacity has a lot of free courses you can take. There's Code Academy that have an interactive console where you can learn each of the concepts in a different way. Um, how do you work with TimerIngest? I think this is related to this previous question. So oftentimes at this juncture in history of programming, many of the things you're thinking of is probably already created. So knowing how to Google is also a skill in itself. So let's just say JS timer library, and some developer out there probably created, see here, flip clock, TimerJS, easy TimerJS. Oftentimes what you're thinking of has already been done, and you don't want to like reinvent the wheel. So Google it first. If whatever library you find doesn't really suit your use case, then that's where you're gonna have to be creative and implement something the way you want it to work. And oftentimes than not, you will find a library that already exists. Okay, so how to prevent more than 2 instances of icons in Project 2 from showing up when you shuffle. How to prevent more than two instances. Okay, so going back to the game. So I think what the question is asking, like, how do we make sure we're not getting 3 anchors or 3 icons? So going back to the game, if you look at the HTML given to us, we can see it has all 16 cards here as a few classes set so you can get an idea of what it looks like and what's provided through CSS. You can just use the elements that are already here, or you can generate these items dynamically. I've seen plenty of students have a array of font awesome classes, and they'll loop through that and create the elements dynamically. Or I've seen students just keep the elements here, just set a function when the page loads is going to add a class to keep these cards hidden, and just add listeners based on what's already here. And there's other ways too. So there's you're really better off just staying with what Udacity provided. Project 2, what are smaller steps? Can we go back after course and make it interesting? Um, I'm sure that you can just stick to the rubric and make sure it passes all of the specs on the rubric. And once it's graded, you can't really resubmit to a project that's been completed or marked as completed. So you can always add changes to your GitHub repository. But as far as a submission to the classroom project, once it completes, then you're good to go. Now, for the memory card game, how would I make the application pause for a short moment and show a non-matched cards for a sec before converting them back? How would I make the application pause for a short moment and show a non-matching card, non-matched cards for a second before covering them back up? So I think basically a hint. I think that's what this question is asking. So that's a lot to cover. I want to get to all of these, but just to give an idea, let me come to my GitHub for a quick second. And I'm going to open my implementation. And by the way, this project wasn't here when I took it, so I had to do it just to get an understanding what you students are going through. So here's my project. In my game, I have a function that shows you all the cards just for a quick second, and it shuffles each page load or each time you reset it. And I also added this hint button right here that When you click it, it just gives you a hint for 2 items. And you click it again, it just randomly selects 2 cards that match, just to give a hint. So my first tip is to understand the way functions work, and programming things happen synchronously or in order. So to give an idea, let's say you had a function. First thing you do is just stop timer, right? And based on the previous question, you would have a function that you would call here to stop the timer. And then you would just say flip. Let's say flip non-matched cards, right? Basically the same thing I did with my implementation, just grab 2 that's not flipped yet. And then finally, in this function, let's say resume timer. So this is just a basic concept, just to pretty much use pseudocode and just outline what you want a function to do. I understand that happens synchronously. So first thing you want to do is just stop the timer. Then you want to get 2 cards that are not matching. And then once you match them, then you just want to resume the timer. All right. So going to this question, how do you make the timer start when the game starts and not when the page loads? Good question. So let's go back to the project and let's take a look at app.js. So we know we have variables, and variables hold information. So what I'm thinking is, let's say that initial click equals false. So pretty much I'm going to use this variable to determine if there was an initial click. So since I'm setting it to false, when the page loads by default, it won't start the timer. Now let's say I have a variable that has all of the cards in the deck. Use document.query selector all. I'll grab all the list items with the class card. And we've seen before this returns a node list, right? Since it's a list type object, we can loop over it. So I'm going to do dot for each. Now in this, for each function, you know, card is a reference to an HTML element from this node list. And HTML elements have a method called add event listener. Takes in 2 arguments, a string of the event you want to listen to, and then the function to run when it happens. Callback. Right? I know each card is going to be using this same anonymous function. You can abstract this away to a named function or have it here. Either way works fine. Now, in this function, we can check if there was an initial click by using an if statement. If initial click is false, you know that the first time a card is clicked, then that must be the very first card. So I'm going to reassign that to true. So the next time a card gets clicked, then we know that it's not the first click. And then here we can do, all right, timer, right? Go ahead and give that a try. Not that one. Let's try this one. So if I click a card, and we can see the timer starts. It didn't start until we click the first card. And then we can see it's moving. And if I click another card, you can see we're not getting duplicates because we have a variable that we're using as a reference to tell if there was an initial click or not. So hopefully that helps. All right, now how to get started with Project 3 Classic Arcade Game. Okay, that's good to see some students making progress. Congratulations to everyone. I know it's challenging. Udacity actually updates their courses quite often, so you guys are learning more skills than I did when I took this course. So that's good news. So let me actually go ahead and grab a copy of this arcade game. So I'm going to come down to here and grab the assets provided, and I'm going to download it. I'm sorry, Brandon, can you see the screen? Is it too small? Okay, so let me.
That's better, thanks.
Okay, my apologies. Let me open that folder and let's see what we have here. Let me open that into the browser. And we have a blank screen. So part of debugging is just identifying whatever issues you have, and more times than not, you want to come into the console. So I'm going to inspect the page, come into the console, and we can see that we have an error. It tells us the type of error, which is causing it, what function what function ran into this error, and the file that it's referencing. So I'm going to come into JS folder, engine.js. All right, now this is in enemy 3, all enemies is not defined. So let's come down here and we have all enemies dot for each. So we're trying to call an array method on an array that doesn't exist yet. So what I'm going to do is just stop the function that's causing the error. I try to refresh it, and all enemies not defined. We get error on line 152. And same thing. We're trying to call a method on an object that doesn't exist. So this is inside the random entity functions. So I'm going to just stop what's causing the error and refresh it. And so far, so good. So here's the blank, well, I'm sorry, not blank, but the canvas and the game board provided by Udacity. Basically, what this project wants students to demonstrate is their understanding of constructor functions and object-oriented programming, right? So let's come into resources. We don't really need to touch anything here. This provided asset file. This is the game engine provided asset file. We really don't need to do much here. The game or the provided files is structured around you creating an array object that's going to have all of your enemy instances and player instance. So if we come to app.js, we have a few starter code that they provided. They created a constructor function and modified the prototype of that constructor, give us two methods that all enemy instances will inherit. Now, for those who don't really have a comfortable understanding with constructor functions, let me actually just give you an idea of how it works in JavaScript, because JavaScript is a prototype-based language, not a class-based. So I'm going to come into this sandbox here, and in this blank script, I'm going to open a console, and let's get started with prototype-based languages. So we know an object is a data structure, and it is a collection of properties with an associate.
Sorry, I'm not sure.
With name and value, right? This page does a really great job explaining the concept of objects, not just in JavaScript, but in programming in general. So an object is a collection of properties, and a property is an association between a name or a key and a value. A property's value can be a function, in which case the property is known as a method, right? And we can access methods using the dot notation or bracket notation. Now, JavaScript and other programming languages have built-in objects that are provided by that language, such as arrays, date object, booleans, right? These are all types of data to represent different types of information, like numbers and strings. And we have different types of data that are called primitives. A primitive is pretty much a data that's not an object and has no methods, right? And some of the examples are strings, numbers, booleans, and symbols. And just to give an idea of what a primitive is, I'm going to come into the sandbox page and just type in 1 is equal to 1, and that's true. True, which is a boolean, equal to true, and that's true. There's nothing we can do to change that logic. 1 will always be 1. True will always be true, right? Now, strings are primitives. So in theory, if I come back and say I is equal to I, that should be true. I will always be I. So in addition to the built-in objects that programming languages have, we can define our own types. Now, in JavaScript, a prototype-based language, that's known as a constructor, right? A constructor function is a function that pretty much creates a certain type of object. Now, to create a constructor, I'm going to first create a variable. I'm going to use a constant. And I'm just going to call this, let's say, person. All right. Now this will be equal to a function, person, and it's going to accept 2 arguments, name and age. Now in programming, we need some sort of way to reference a particular object, because we can have multiple objects of the same type, and we need a way to reference a particular one. And there's a keyword for that, which is this. So this is a keyword. It behaves a little bit differently in different programming languages. This is pretty much a keyword that will point to a particular object based on how the function is called. So in the context of a constructor function, this will point to objects of that particular instance once it's created. So in this constructor function, I'm going to say this name will be whatever name was at the time the function was called. This age will be whatever age is at the time the function was called. All right, so we have a basic constructor function that's going to assign some properties to it based on the arguments passed into it. And to create a new instance of this constructor function, I'm going to say let Ryan equals, we have to use the new keyword, just so you guys can see. The new operator creates an instance of a user-defined object type or one of the built-in object types that has a constructor function. So you can see they're following the same syntax. They have a function called car that accepts the arguments and is going to assign some properties to it. And we create a new instance using the new keyword. So I'm going to say new person. And let's say Ryan. Age, I don't mind sharing that. I'm 21, happily 21. And if I come to the console, call Ryan, we can see it's an object of the type person, right? If I come to the prototype, I can tell that it was created by this person function, right? Now, basically, prototyping is just object cloning from another object. So if I wanted to add properties to this instance, I can do that like it's any other type of object. Let's say Ryan.height, and let's just say 6. For Ryan, we have a height property 6. Although it wasn't defined in its constructor function, I can still extend it to have more properties, which is kind of like an advantage for prototype-based languages. And class-based languages, you can only have the properties that's defined in its class. But with prototype-based, you're basically cloning from a starting point that we call a constructor, and you can work your way beyond that. Now, to pretty much add inheritance, we have to modify the prototype. And we can do that by first calling the constructor function to person prototype. And then from here, I can start defining what properties I want all person objects to have. So I can say species equal to Homo sapien, right? Now, when I refresh it, I can see inside the prototype, we have that species property in the constructor on the prototype. So that means I can call Ryan.species, right? And we get Homo sapien. Now, again, this is prototype-based language, so I can make Ryan have his own species key. Let's say this is equal to human. And if I call Ryan, it has that. If I call Ryan species, we get human. If I were to delete it, call Ryan.species, again, it goes back to Homo sapien because the way of prototype-based languages and how it works, when you call a property of a object, it's going to check that object instance itself and go up the prototype chain to find what prototype object has it. And if no prototype object has it, get undefined because nowhere in the prototype chain was there a property race. So we got undefined. So with that, coming back to the game, we see familiar syntax. We know that this is a constructor function because we're using the this keyword inside of it. And we are adding some methods to the prototype, meaning all enemy objects will have an update method, right? All enemy objects will have a render method. And we know inside a constructor function, this will point to that particular instance. We have context. This is coming from the provided engine file. Basically, apologies. Basically, this is the method that will draw that instance to the screen. So what you have to do is create your own player constructor and modify its prototype to add the methods that you needed to work for the game. So you can see they have a player.handle. So you're going to need to add a handle input method to your player constructor function. Pretty much you're going to need one for rendering it to the screen. You're going to need one for handling an input. And you're going to need, I guess you can have methods for checking your position on the screen, making sure you're not going off the game board. And just building out all the functionality that you need in order to make sure the game works. Now, my apologies if I kind of went over that. I'll make sure I get to everyone's questions. Okay, so lesson 16.5, installing Git. I can't get it to work. I'm in a Mac. I'm trying to proceed and none of the lessons is working. 16.9, following to add info to gulp file, getting resources also. Need video with how to make it work. Also, explanation could be better. How to use the Udacity files to move on this lesson. I'm not too sure if gulp and task automation was part of front end. It probably is now, but it wasn't when I was a part of it. I know this is part of mobile web specialist, but anyways, with gulp, I'm still fairly new to gulp myself. I haven't used it much often, but I know as a developer, the first place I look to is the documentation. So I'm just going to go to the browser and search for gulp.js. And we have a few links. I know GitHub is a good place to look. And their official website is another good place to look. So let's go ahead and take a look at both. In addition to their websites, there are a lot of people out there who make blog posts that help others get started with how to create automation tasks. For example, HackerNoon is one I'm familiar with that have blog posts on how to use modern JavaScript libraries. All right, so I can see here they have an example of a gulp file. They're requiring some modules. They're defining some gulp tasks, right? They're defining a default task. And inside the default, they're specifying which other tasks to run as part of the default. So if I come to the GitHub page, I'm going to come down to the README. What is gulp? They have a description of what it is, how it works, how to install it. So npm install gulp next. They have the different versions, documentation, and here's a sample that they provide. It's a gulp file.js. This file will give you a taste of what gulp does. With gulp, you can just pretty much minify your files to make sure they're ready for production. And I want to make sure I'm answering this question. I can't get it to work. I'm on a Mac. I've tried proceeding and none of the lessons working. On to add info to gulp. Errors also. Need video with. My apologies. I'm not too sure how to answer this. If it's not working, my first thing is to uninstall it using npm and try reinstalling that, and hopefully that works. Okay, so I took the first Grow with Google challenge, and so took all of the JavaScript lessons. Now I am trying to do project 2, and I forgot a lot of what I have learned. What are some strategies to work on my I think this may be a duplicate. Yeah, I think those are duplicates. So best way to practice and quickly gain confidence. I don't recommend having the mindset of quickly, but practice makes perfect. The longer you do something, the more you have confidence doing it. So going back to my example earlier, what I personally like to do is just create a sandbox and just test out any code that I see or any concepts that I'm learning from an article or from their documentation. And it also helps to understand how you learn. So I can't really speak for everyone. I do recommend YouTube. I do recommend Udacity's free courses or Code Academy or many of the online resources that are available. All right. Connecting a push and pull to GitHub from a repo repository from local git bash. I keep getting an error. Connecting a push and pull. Okay, I think I can do that really quickly. So I'm gonna come to GitHub and I'm going to create a new repository. And let's just call this sandbox. Create this repository. And here is how it looks when there are no files here. Git is giving us some commands of how to push local files to this online repository. So the first thing we need to do is in our project folder root, we're going to add this command. Or I'm sorry, we're going to run this command. So let's give it a try. I'm going to use git bash here. And I'm going to run git init to initialize this repository. And you can see I have hidden folders showing, so I can see what folders have a repository in it. You're going to see .git. All right, now you can add README. My sandbox doesn't have that, so I'm going to skip that. Git commit -m. This is how you add a commit message, but first let me add. You can add files individually, or you can add all of it at once using --all operand. Add all the files to the staging, and then you can add a commit message following the syntax right here. So I'm going to do git commit -m. You put a message in quotations. I'm just going to say initial, which is my personal convention, knowing this is the first commit. There are 2 files because my sandbox only had the index and the script. Now, here is how you add your repository reference to your local repository. So you're going to need to do git remote add. This operand right here is optional. You can call it whatever you want. It's just a reference. And then the next operand is the actual link to the repository you want to connect to. So I'm going to copy this link and I'm going to do git remote add. I don't have to use origin. I can use whatever name I want. I'm going to say repo, which is short for repository, and then I'm going to paste that link right here. You can check all the repositories this one is connected to by just running git remote. Also see the list of commands just by running git, and you get a list of commands you can run and a quick little summary of what that command does. Now, once we've added our files and we've connected to this repository online, we're going to push it from our local branch to the online branch. So I'm going to do git push -u. I'm pushing the repo repository. And by default, when you create a repository, it creates a master branch, which is why you see master right here. So I'm going to push that branch. It's going to package the files, pressing, uploading, and it creates a new master branch on the online repository. So if I were to refresh it, I can see there's one commit. It has that initial commit message. I can add a README, and I can look inside, and this is exactly what I have in my local repository. Now with GitHub, you can edit your files online, right? So let's say someone else is connected to this repository and they push changes to it. Or let's say you come here and you edit it online. Let's say I add a title to it. I hit commit changes. I come back, I can see that this file has a change to it, there's a commit to it. And this branch online has the most recent updates. So if you know that your online repository has the more recent updates, that's when you want to pull. Git doesn't allow you to pull if the online repository doesn't have the up-to-date commit messages. So basically with pushing and pulling, you can only push or pull the branch that has the most recent commit messages. So in this particular situation, since the up-to-date changes are online, I'm going to do git pull repo master, right? Right now, I don't see this title filled in, but if I pull it, I can see that it pulled it and we have the changes here. And now both of these branches, the online repository and the local repository, are consistent. They both have the same commit messages. So if I do git status on master branch, your branch is up to date with repo master, the commit working clean tree. So everything's consistent as of right now. Okay. Let's tackle this. I do not know how to break down my problems. Looking at a problem like building a triangle gets intimidating, and the syntax of complex functions get confusing. When to use curly braces, where to place the return statement, if you should use a for loop or not. I can't seem to get past the blank screen. That's something I think every beginner goes through. And again, programming is not an easy field. It's very taxing and it requires a lot of logic and critical thinking. So once you get an understanding of what programming is and how it works, once you learn something at its foundation, then I think that helps out the rest of the way in the path of learning that particular field. So more specifically, the syntax. Just to give you a few tricks, whenever you see a dot, you should think to yourself, okay, some object is accessing some property, right? Whenever you see a dot, you should think, okay, some object is acting some property. Whenever you see one equal sign, you should think, okay, something is being assigned to a variable or some storage mechanism. Whenever you see parentheses, you should think, okay, a function is being called, right? So certain characters are associated with certain meanings or certain functionalities, right? Curly braces should pop up in your mind, okay, this is a function, this is a scope. If you see curly braces, or I'm sorry, if you see parentheses, that's a function. If you see equal sign, that's an assignment operator. And basically just knowing what characters mean, because no matter what script file you read, they all have to follow the same rules. And again, I recommend reading the documentation to understand the rules of the game. So, and not just for JavaScript, but anything. Like if you buy a desk from a furniture store, it's going to come with a manual on how to set it up. So with that analogy, just knowing that whatever it is you're using, there's documentation on it, and knowing where to find the information that you're looking for. So in this particular instance, I'm going to say JS documentation. And on a personal level, I recommend finding which one works best for you. Okay, so next. In an unlinear thinking, in what order do you place your functions? That's a good question. So in programming, things happen synchronously and code is read from top to bottom, left to right, like a book. So I would place my functions based on what function needs other functions to work. And to give an example of that, let's just say I have I can just comment this out. Or actually, no, I'm going to leave it here. So let's say I have a function called add. Takes in two arguments, A and B. The return addition of A and B, right? So this is considered a pure function. Some of you may have heard of that before. Basically, a pure function is a function where the return value is only determined by its input values, not by observing side effects, right? So this function doesn't depend on any outside information in order to do what it's defined to do. If you give it two variables, it's going to give it a particular output, right? Give an example of that. I'm going to come here to the sandbox and I'm going to call add. I pass in 1 and 2. It's going to give me 3. I call it again. The result is the same. So whenever the inputs are the same, the output should be exactly the same. This function isn't depending on any outside information. Its output is directly related to the inputs that it's given. So as far as where to place functions, if I know a function depends on another function to work, then I'll place those below functions that don't need other functions to work. So I know add doesn't need any other function to work. So let's say I have a function here. Let's say function add, then multiply. Let's say I have A and B. I have, let's say, C is equal to this function here. I know that this function depends on add. So it has to come after add is declared. Basically, just you want to order them to where the function above doesn't need any function below it, if that makes sense. You want to have your pure functions coming before any other impure functions. All right. Now, for this one, is it good to use third-party library for styling web pages, for example, Bootstrap? There's a pro and con to that. Let me start off by saying that you typically don't want to reinvent the wheel. At this juncture, there are a lot of situations that's been tackled. For example, Bootstrap, there are a lot of frameworks out there to do things that we would typically do instead of doing the grunt work. So it's good to use libraries out there, but the only trade-off is that since a lot of web pages are using the same framework, a lot of them will typically look the same. So you may notice a lot of web pages have the grid-based layout that Bootstrap is famous for, and you may lose originality if you use too much of what is provided in that framework. So it's not bad, but you want to have originality to stand out. So I say use it sparingly, but it's there for a reason. So do use it and do try to be creative. So hopefully that answers that question. At the end of the day, it's subjective. My biggest challenge right now is getting a build system with Task Runner installing and working as expected. I'm normally quite at home on command line interface, but Node really seems to dislike me and on my computer. I'm having a challenge right now getting a build system with Task Runner installing and working as expected. That's seems like a bit of a challenge. Not something I can do right now based on these time constraints. I'm actually going to do a video. I've actually created 2 recently, and I'm actually going to come back to this topic and share what I find back in Slack. But on a broad level, like I personally just love documentation and just going to the people who created it And if something's not working, I try to uninstall it and just reinstall it. I personally haven't had much troubles with that, so forgive me if I'm not much of help, but I'm going to take time and tackle this specific issue, and hopefully it solves a lot of students' concerns in that regard. Okay, so best way to assign media queries. So you can decide how you want to apply media queries based on the scope of the project or application you're building. You can include media queries within a regular CSS file, or you can add a little rule to a link tag, and based on the viewport or whatever media queries you set, that way it will take effect under certain conditions. And to give an example of that, let me come to Google and type in CSS media queries. Let me see if I can find some implementations of it. All right, so here's an example of how to add styling to the print media query. So basically, when a user wants to print the screen, it's going to apply styles within this selection. You can add styles based on the width of the viewport, right? And in addition to these media queries, you can bundle them together in, let's say, a CSS file. Oh, apologies. I'm going to rename this to, let's say you have your styles here, and then let's say you have another style sheet based on a specific viewport, such as 800 CSS. And in this, you would have styles that are designed to work at this particular viewport. And you pretty much create styles for each viewport, and you would order them inside your index based on what takes priority. So if you want styles from the max viewport first, you would add the first link tag, and then for each subsequent link tag, you would add the styling sheet for that particular viewport. Okay, so I don't understand the event listeners, and I also don't understand the different kinds of interface. Um, I'm not particularly sure what this student is asking about interface, but as far as event listeners, let's take a look at JavaScript event listener. So here's a good link. Here's another one. So the add event listener works on HTML objects, right? So if I type in window in the console, just to show you very quickly, the window is literally the browser itself. And it has a lot of methods available to track certain events. For example, on blur, on close, on click, on change. A lot of these listeners that you can add to any HTML element. So basically what it does is You specify the event that you want to listen for, and then you call a function that will run whenever that event gets triggered. So, for example, if I come here and I type in document dot body, I know this is the body. So since the body is an HTML element, I should be able to add event listener. Let's say click. I'm gonna run a function that's going to log admit one. Okay. Let me just add the click here. So if I click body, yeah, let me just height is 100 view height. Console, if I click it, we can see admit one. This event clicking is triggering this function to run, which will console log admit one. Why do tags containing script 3.js create its own canvas element in the browser? What is the best way to style it? Why do tags containing script 3.js create its own canvas element in the browser? I'm thinking this is in relation to Project 3, the game. So let's take a look at what's going on there. Okay, so back to the game. We have 3 provided script files: resource, app, and engine. Inside engine, we have this canvas right here. And it's being created via this document.createElement object. We're creating canvas tag, and it's being appended to the screen. So it's not in the source file itself, but being generated dynamically. And as far as styling it, let's say we inspect it, and it has this width, height property. I can assign an ID to it by doing canvas. I know all HTML element objects have a set attribute. How do you spell it? I'm going to set the ID to game board. I refresh it, and I can see it has the ID game board. Now, because it has this ID, I can come into CSS, and I can select game board. Let's say border equals 1 pixel, solid line, and let's say red. Refresh this and have a red border around our canvas right here. So hopefully that helps with that question. Having difficulty starting the Fargo clone, where to begin? There's no right way to begin. One place you can begin is just completing the enemy constructor that was provided for you, right? So in the engine files provided for us, Udacity is assuming that we have an array called all enemies, right? So let's come out to the app, and we can see in their comments, now instantiate your objects, place all enemy objects in an array called all enemies. Place the player object in a variable called player. So Udacity is assuming that we're going to create these objects. So let's go ahead and create them. We say let's all enemies equals empty array, right? And let's say we have constant here equals all right. This is just a basic example. Now I'm going to say let's player equals new player. Let's say it can accept a character, image will be character. If character is falsy, then we're going to provide a default, which is images slash, let's say, charboy. PNG, right? So we have this player variable, we have this all enemies variable. So I can come back and uncomment these. Make down, uncomment these. Now, Udacity is also expecting that the player instance has a render method. So I'm going to come into the player constructor, modify its prototype, so it can have a render method. And this function is essentially going to copy what this one does. We're going to get the context is the canvas tag. We're going to draw this dot, let's say image, x, the x coordinate and the y coordinates. So let's just say this dot x equals what? 400. Say this dot I. Actually, I'm gonna say y is 400. Say 300. Just for the sake of argument, this is some starter code. Let's go ahead and save this and let's see what happens. Also, please don't be afraid to try out code. Trial and error makes perfect. So if you rush it, player.update is not a function. This is in engine 97, 997, 97. Player.update. So let's go ahead and create that. And I really don't need to do anything at this particular moment, so I can just leave it empty. And there we go. We have the player right there. So basically what's happening is in this app file, since it comes before engine, this app file is pretty much declaring all of the constructor function and methods for the characters that are going to be on the game board. So in this player constructor, we're saying that this .image is this image file right here. This is starting position for the X coordinate and for the Y coordinate. We defined a render method that all player instances will have. And what it's going to do is draw itself at its particular X and Y coordinates. And we just created a new instance of it. So by the time it comes to the engine file, when it's calling player.render, it's getting drawn onto the screen right here. So I think that kind of helps for a good starting point. Now, for variables that are displayed to the user on the page, should these variables be stored solely in the DOM? Or should there always be a representation of the element in a variable in JavaScript, for example, with a move counter for a game? For variables that are displayed to users on the page, should these variables be stored solely in the DOM? So the DOM is just a representation of elements on the page. If you're talking about JavaScript rendering content to the DOM, you can abstract that into a particular function itself. So to give an example of that, let's come back to the sandbox that we have. Or rather, let's go back to the game. Right, so we have this timer function, the stopper function, and this information is inside the script, not really visible to the user. Let's see how we can add it to the screen. So in the HTML file, I'm gonna go ahead and create a paragraph tag, and I'm gonna give it an ID of time counts. Right. This way I can select it, pinpoint it later inside the script. So I'm gonna come back to the app, and here is a function that's gonna format that time. Now I'm gonna create a function that's responsible for adding it to this element right here. So I'm gonna say function under time. Now I'm gonna create a variable that's gonna say time equals, calling this function to get the time. And say let message text equals documents.get element by ID. I want to get this element. So I'm going to use that ID. And then I can simply do message text that's inner text is equal to time. Now I can literally consolidate all of this into just one line. But first, I'm going to select this. And since I know this is going to return an HTML element, I can chain on the inner text and that equal to the format time function. I'm going to save this right after I place it right here so it can show every second. So if I refresh and let's say I click, and we can see the timer is right there. So basically, I have a function that's responsible for updating the content in an element with the current time. If I were to stop it, you see it stops. Now, general question, how would Ryan approach something he has never done before? How would he think through it? Okay, so given how I'm 3 years into programming, and not just 3 years, but 3 years straight, like I program every day, I'm reading every day. I've kind of developed my own type of mental map, for lack of better terms. Pretty much I have a blueprint that kind of helps me get started. So the first thing that I do when I'm dealing with something is let's say I'm creating a new project. So for creating new projects, the first thing is I have to decide, like, what is it I'm trying to build? What app is it? How will it work? The second thing I'm going to do is, what do I need in order to build it, right? So let's say you're trying to build a house. Okay, what is it? We're trying to build a house. All right, what are you gonna need to build a house? You're gonna need screwdrivers, wood, cinder blocks, materials, pretty much gathering all the assets and the tools needed, required. Now, once you have what you need, you have to, what steps are needed to implement it? So as far as creating new projects, this is just my basic 3-step question as to how I'm going to get started or where to start. So as far as the first step, it's really important to understand what it is you're trying to build. So you understand what tools you're going to need. Once you get the certain tools that you have, then you just devise a plan as to how do you want it to work, or what steps are needed to implement that, right? So as far as coming into an existing project, such as when I'm at work, things I ask myself are, one, what is it that I'm dealing with? What is being used? What tools are they using for that project or that application? Where did it come from? And by that I mean, how did it do? How's it working? Is everything fine? Like, what's working, what's not working? Pretty much diagnosing the current status and condition of the app. Right. So once I get pretty much an understanding of what it is I'm working with, the tools being used for it, where did it come from as far as when it first launched to where I'm jumping in. And then I often ask myself, where is it going, right? Because projects can change. So once you get an idea of what it is, what's being used, where did it come from, and where do we want the application to go, that kind of helps us gauge at, do we need to change tools, or do we need to change steps that were taken to get to where that project is, and what steps do we need to take to move to where it's going. This is just a broad idea of how I approach new projects. I'm sure there are better visuals that illustrate how to approach projects and planning. But as far as personally, I follow this format. Okay, so for live questions, if a ternary is more than one line, should you use it over an if statement? Ternaries can work multiple lines. It's based on your style of programming. You know, if statements and ternaries still work the same, but just normally you can only just use one statement in a ternary as opposed to an if, where you can have a block of statements to run that will span multiple lines. So based on how much instructions or statements you need to make, that should probably dictate whether if you should use a ternary or an if statement. And right now, last one. Hi, Coach Ryan. Hi. How do you clear variables on restart that might hold information from the previous game? This is memory game. One student would like to know this answer, please. How to clear variables on restart? I'm thinking on browser refresh by restart, or okay, let me cover both scenarios. So do I have it open? Do I have it open? Actually, I do. Okay, so whenever a page first loads, the information will be based on what the browser read in the scripts. And data doesn't persist in front end or the client side. There's no database to keep track. So whenever you refresh it, it starts based on what's being read from the code. Now, to implement your own refresh, basically, what you may want to do is have a function, let's say, function restart game. In this function, you may want to first, let's say we want to clear the timer. Let's make sure it's stopped. You may want to reinitialize all of the variables, right? Our minutes and seconds. And you want to set this back to false so it can work inside of this callback that we have here. And then that should encapsulate all the statements needed to restart the game. So let's give an example. Let's say we click and we have this timer right here. Now let's say we stop the timer and we restart the game. We call that. And let's say I call render time. Let's see, start at 0. If I call seconds, you can see it's back to 0. See, initial click is set back to false, and pretty much resetting the state and variables back to their original values that they first had. Okay. Hopefully I've answered these questions to the best of my abilities. For questions that kind of required a lot of time to get into it, do send me a message on Slack. I'm going to do my best to try to research some of these concepts and topics and get back to you with any information that I find. And with that, I hope you enjoyed. Hopefully I helped answer your questions, and I look forward to seeing you guys continue in this nanodegree program.
Thanks again, Ryan. And a reminder to everybody that we'll be continuing Study Jam tonight until 9 p.m. Come on over to the Live Help channel if you need any support. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.